now tuning into BaisWave.
Hi, and welcome to the first episode of Based on True Events. In this podcast, we dive deeper into topics your history teacher missed out on telling you. From each region, we will provide you with this extra knowledge. In class, we often talk about how the Soviet Union shaped warfare and politics in Europe. The Eastern Front, the Cold War divide, the Iron Curtain. But the USSR's influence didn't stop at Europe's borders. So, in today's episode, we're turning east, specifically East Asia. Nonetheless, this episode isn't just for students of East Asia. It will be also particularly relevant for students of Eurasia. But even if you don't study either of these regions, I'm sure you'll still find this topic interesting, so stay tuned. Alright, enough rambling. Let's get to the bread and butter and discuss the history of the USSR's involvement in the East Asia region from its founding to the end of the Second World War. I hope you enjoy it. Let's dig in. The involvement of the Soviet Union with East Asia, or rather the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, as it was then called, began at its very inception when Japan intervened in the Russian Civil War in support of the anti-Bolshevik whites in 1918. Although the French had pleaded with the Japanese to join the intervention the previous year, the Japanese government declined. The decision of Japan to join the intervention was eventually influenced by British plans to send a cruiser to Vladivostok without consulting the Japanese government, which in turn prompted Japan to send 2 battleships to arrive before the British Navy. The Allies believed that a powerful naval presence would encourage the whites to continue fighting, but it actually had the opposing effect, leading to growing anti-Japanese sentiment that resulted in angry locals attacking a Japanese-owned store. This incident led the Japanese government to deploy a massive occupation force totaling approximately 70,000 soldiers, advancing as far as Lake Baikal. The occupation lasted 4 years, despite other Allied troops leaving Vladivostok after only 2 years, and ended when the last Japanese troops withdrew from Vladivostok in 1922. However, Japan did not fully end its involvement until 1925, when it ceded control of Northwest Sakhalin to the USSR. As the Japanese withdrew from Russia, the Red Army was consolidating its power across the region. In the end, the intervention was widely seen as a failure that left deep scars in Japanese political life. Like the Japanese, the Beiyang government, the then internationally recognized government of China, sent its own troops as a part of the Allied intervention in the Russian Civil War. The Russian Civil War spread to nearby areas, specifically Tuva, formerly a Chinese territory annexed by the Russian Empire, and Mongolia, that declared independence after the Xinhai Revolution, which, after an occupation by the Chinese warlord general Xu Shunzhang of the Anhui clique, fell briefly into the hands of the legendary white general turned rogue Roman von Ungen-Sternberg, before his army was in turn defeated by the Red Army and Mongolian partisans. Ultimately, Mongolia and Tuva became Soviet puppet states. Finally, stepping away from the Russian Civil War, we need to mention the less obvious Soviet involvement in Chinese politics. As you could probably imagine, it played a crucial role in the creation of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921. A little-known fact often downplayed by the CCP is the role of Grigory Votinsky, who had been sent by the Comintern the previous year to establish contacts with the Chinese revolutionaries and play a major role in setting the stage for the creation of the Communist Party. The Soviet role does not end here, as Moscow had already been supporting the Kuomintang at the time in its fighting against the warlords by notably sending military advisors to train the Chinese Revolutionary Army, but also working towards cooperation between the CCP and the KMT, which eventually led to the signing of the First United Front in 1923. But the honeymoon did not last. Sino-Soviet relation collapsed in 1929 after Chinese forces stormed the Soviet consulate, attempting to arrest Soviet officials and dismantle their management of the Chinese Eastern Railway, a line originally built by Imperial Russia under a concession from the Chiang government in order to assert full Chinese control. After weeks of failed diplomacy, Stalin authorized a military intervention. In response, China mobilized its own forces as well as enlisting white émigrés who had fled to Manchuria after losing the Russian Civil War. The Soviets quickly overwhelmed the far less prepared Chinese forces, restoring their control of the railway. But another power was paying attention, Japan. Observing the conflict, Japan recognized how vulnerable Chinese authority over Manchuria really was, and in 1931 it acted on that insight, staging the Mukden incident. Fast forward to 1934, and tension flared again. After 3 years of chaos in Xinjiang, triggered by the Kumul rebellion, the Soviets intervened to support the regional warlord Cheng Shicai. Moscow sent troops led by the OGPU secret police, a predecessor of the NKVD and then KGB, which operated covertly wearing non-Soviet uniforms to conceal direct involvement. These forces blended in with the Russian émigré units already fighting against Cheng's enemies, and together they launched a coordinated campaign that crushed the advancing enemy's army and secured Xinjiang as de facto Soviet client state.
Alright, moving away from China for a moment, let us return to Japan. Since 1932, the Soviets had engaged the Japanese in a series of border clashes, but none were of significant scale, at least not until the Battle of Lake Hassan in 1938. The conflict began when troops from Manchukuo, a Japanese puppet state in Manchuria, crossed the Soviet border, believing that the USSR had moved the boundary markers, and emboldened by the defection of an NKVD officer who disclosed the perceived weakness of the Soviet far eastern flank. After suffering considerable losses, the Soviets pushed the Japanese back, but were unable to deliver a decisive blow. Nevertheless, as Japanese troops could not hold their positions without further escalation, Japan sought a ceasefire and withdrew. Japan tried its luck again nearly a year later at Khalkhin-Gol, when Manchukuoan forces, acting under the largely autonomous Kwantung Army, attacked Mongolian cavalry, Mongolia being a Soviet ally. A full-scale battle soon developed, involving over 40,000 men on both sides. This is where the future Marshal of Victory first came to prominence. Georgy Zhukov was summoned to take command at Khalkhin-Gol. Ironically, he feared he was being called to Moscow to be purged, but instead he was given the role that launched his career. Zhukov organized a carefully planned combined Tsar offensive and achieved a decisive victory. This defeat became a key factor in persuading the Japanese to abandon the Hokushin-ron, known as the Northern Expansion Doctrine, which had envisioned an attack on the Soviet Far East to seize resource-rich territories as far as Lake Baikal. Meanwhile, the Second Sino-Japanese War had already begun since 1937. The Soviet Union began providing large-scale military aid to the Kuomintang government in that same year under the Sino-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. In fact, the USSR was the single biggest supplier of military assistance to China before the Western Allies began sending their own aid, extending their support to even providing entire air squadrons. Nonetheless, it was not due to Stalin's good heart or compassion for the revolutionary cause, but rather a pragmatic decision to keep Japan occupied in China and thus away from the Soviet Far East. Therefore, Soviet aid ended almost as quickly as it had begun. Once the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact was signed, it allowed Moscow to switch its focus to the West and redeploy its Far Eastern troops to face the Germans. The Soviets remained largely inactive in this region until 1945. In February of 1945, the Big Three, Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, met in Yalta to discuss the post-war settlement. During the meeting, the Soviet leader promised Roosevelt that the USSR would join the war against Japan 3 months after the capitulation of Germany. This was not for free, of course. Stalin demanded the return of southern Sakhalin, which had been annexed by Japan after the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, as well as the Kuril Islands. Moreover, Stalin also sought a Soviet presence in Port Arthur and control over the Chinese Eastern Railway. The United States agreed to these demands. As promised, the Soviets invaded Manchuria exactly 3 months after the end of the war in Europe. The attack was brutal. Japanese intelligence failed to correctly assess the level of Soviet preparedness in the region and was caught completely off guard when it received the Soviet declaration of war. With barely an hour to prepare before the Soviet invasion commenced, Japanese troops were left helpless against the advancing Red Army. The Soviets were more experienced, better prepared, better equipped, and possessed superior technology. The massive Soviet offensive overwhelmed the Japanese, who began to panic and attempt a frantic retreat. Nonetheless, Operation August Storm did not proceed entirely smoothly. Some Japanese units proved fanatically determined, resorting to suicide attacks against Soviet tanks and even attempting kamikaze-style strikes with aircraft. Not even the Imperial surrender broadcast immediately stopped them. However, this merely gave the Red Army more time to advance. The fighting finally ceased after the message of surrender was communicated directly to the remaining Japanese troops. As you can see, the interwar period in East Asia was a particularly chaotic one. From constant border clashes with the Japanese to the messy relations with China to even fighting along the Whites in Xinjiang. While the situation might have looked bleak for the Bolsheviks in 1918, They ultimately prevailed and emerged victorious in 1945. Nonetheless, this trend doesn't seem to continue in the decades that followed, as shown by the Sino-Soviet split and the broader Cold War context. But we don't have time to cover that in today's episode, so maybe that's something for another time. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Let us know in the comments what else we should talk about. Thanks for listening, and until next time.